Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Nana Poku, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the inaugural lecture of Professor Muthulisi Siwela. The Vice Chancellor conveys his congratulations and best wishes to Professor Muthulisi Siwela. The Acting Deputy Vice Chancellor, Professor Fatwani Mudau, conveys his apologies and congratulates Professor Siwela on his promotion and thanks him for his contributions to the School of Agriculture, Earth and Environmental Sciences. My name is Neil Kubinelli, and I am the Dean of Research in the College of Agriculture, Engineering and Science. Inaugural lectures form part of the university's public lecture series and may only be presented by newly appointed full professors who have been appointed in academic schools and centers. Inaugural lectures present an opportunity for showcasing the exciting and groundbreaking research and teaching being carried out by professors in our university. Each lecture presents a significant milestone in an academic's career, providing official recognition of their promotion or appointment to full professorship. These lectures are furthermore an ideal opportunity for new professors to introduce themselves and to present an overview of their own contribution to their field to academic peers, students, and research collaborators. Inaugural lectures are also a platform for celebrating a professor's academic achievements with his or her family, friends, mentors, and colleagues. I would like to acknowledge the following guests: members of council, members of the Executive Management Committee, members of Senate, our inaugurant this afternoon, Professor Muthulisi Siwela, family and friends of Professor Siwela, academics and professional staff, students, alumni, and distinguished guests. A special welcome to our guests from universities and organizations within South Africa, the African continent, and across the globe. Distinguished guests, it is my pleasure to introduce our Acting Dean and Head of School of Agriculture, Earth and Environmental Science, Professor Julia Sivia, who will now formally introduce the inaugurant, Professor Muthulisi Siwela. Julia.
Thank you, Professor Kubanali. A very good afternoon to all our viewers from around the world. I would like to introduce to you this afternoon our inaugurant, Professor Siwela. Professor Muthulisi Siwela is a full professor in the discipline of dietetics and human nutrition within the School of Agricultural Earth and Environmental Sciences in the College of Agriculture, Engineering and Science at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, Pietermaritzburg, South Africa. Professor Siwela received his BSc Honours degree in Applied Biology and Biochemistry from the National University of Science and Technology in Bulawayo, Zimbabwe in 1996. He obtained a master's in food science from the University of Pretoria in 2000, which was funded by a competitive bursary that was linked to the SADC Human Capacity Development Initiative in the agricultural and food sciences. He obtained a PhD degree in food science from the University of Pretoria in 2009. Professor Siwela was lecturer in the Department of Food Science and Technology at the University of Venda from 2002 to April 2004. And then joined the discipline of dietetics and human nutrition at UKZN in May 2004 to the present. He was promoted to senior lecturer in 2011, associate professor 2018, and full professor in 2021. He has held several academic administration and management and leadership positions, including former acting dean and head of school and university academic representative on council, and is currently cluster academic leader, school representative on Senate, and Senate representative on the University Institutional Forum. Professor Siwela's research interest lies in evaluation of nutritional and food functional properties and valorization of underutilized traditional and indigenous crops and edible wild plants that are adapted to the sub-Saharan region to promote their utilization. Increased utilization of these food plants would significantly contribute to food and nutrition security and well-being of the predominantly undernourished and economically disadvantaged communities of this region. His research focus is on valorization and fortification of grain cereals and legumes and nuts. Professor Siwela has served as PI, co-PI, and research collaborator of several discipline-focused and multidisciplinary research projects funded by national and international agencies. He has successfully completed the supervision and co-supervision altogether of 26 masters and 17 PhD students, mentored 3 postdoctoral fellows and several academic colleagues, most of whom have been promoted to senior academic ranks. He has been contracted by Durban University of Technology, University of South Africa, and UKZN to facilitate several training workshops for postgraduate students. He is currently supervising more than 10 PhD and master's students altogether. He has examined 51 master's dissertations and 15 PhD theses from 14 universities of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. Professor Siwela has co-authored more than 120 research reports, including some 95 peer-reviewed journal articles, most of which are indexed in leading databases. He has been listed among prolific researchers at UKZN for some consecutive years. He has won 2 research awards in his college. In 2014, he was recipient of a competitive developing country sponsorship award given by the International Union of Food Science and Technology to present a paper at the 17th World Congress of Food Science and Technology and Expo in Montreal, Canada. He is an NRIFC2 rated scientist since 2023. His H indices are Google Scholar 23, Scopus 16, and Web of Science 13. Prof. Siwela has served as a reviewer of several research project proposals submitted to national and international funding agencies, applications for research rating submitted to National Research Foundation, South Africa, and a couple of NRIFC projects, as well as numerous scientific manuscripts submitted for publication in leading international peer-reviewed journals in the fields of nutrition and food science and technology. Professor Siwela is a professional member of South African Association of Food Science and Technology, member of Nutrition Society of Southern Africa, registered professional natural scientist with the South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions, and professional advisory committee member for South African Council for Natural Scientific Professions. Professor Siwela, I now invite you to present your lecture.
Thank you, Professor Spear and the Dean, Professor Neil Kubanao. And I also would like to thank most importantly the attendees or participants of my inaugural lecture. I appreciate them for taking their time, their precious time to listen to me. And more so, most of these are my colleagues, my friends, relatives who have ever been supportive of my long academic career. And therefore, I'll be ever grateful to them. My lecture is, and Professor Julia Spear, thanks for the narrative of my academic accomplishments. I was not aware of some of those details, but they are quite humbling that I could achieve that. I never believed in myself as much as is read as my achievements. So the long journey of conducting research, yes, it has culminated in this presentation, which I'm sharing with you now. My research topic is tackling malnutrition and degenerating health with African traditional and indigenous food plans. Let me put slide. Sorry for the glitch. The outline of my presentation is, as indicated, I'll have an introduction, the outline of the research methodology from which these research outputs leading to this lecture have culminated, and then I'll present some findings of selected studies within the research program that I've been leading. Then there will be conclusions and future perspectives. Introduction. I would want to, since I've been introduced as somebody who is actually concerned about the well-nourishment, the good nourishment and well-being of societies, particularly the population groups in the Sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, I don't have a good story about that presently because, as you indicated in this slide here, the world is facing a nutrition crisis, whereby we have some one in 10 people are hungry or undernourished or malnourished, and 1 in 3 people are overweight or obese. The two are related. Being hungry and undernourished means malnutrition, and the overweight and obese is one of a group of health conditions that are normally called the degenerative health group, whereby our tissues, the human organs are failing because of several factors, including metabolic factors, our behaviors that can be modified, including our dietary habits. So that comes, then the dietary habits become key to my research and my presentation here, because I'm proposing tackling both malnutrition and degenerative health through food plans, African traditional and indigenous food plans. There's just an explanation of those with some little bit of detail about the malnutrition, the definition, and that most of you would know about that. But what I would want us to focus on, that leads to my research focus area, is that this malnutrition is actually prevalent in developing regions, particularly Africa south of the Sahara Desert, the region that we normally call Sub-Saharan Africa. And of even more concern is that the rural communities, particularly children and women, are the ones that are vulnerable to malnutrition. And the major drivers of malnutrition, some people can call them causes, underlying causes, intermediate causes, because malnutrition in itself, when we call about the primary cause as defined there, it means one has not got the right amount of nutrients in the right amounts from the food. But then there will be intermediate causes and what we call some other causes, so which I'm calling drivers. Like some people say malnutrition is due to poverty, food and nutrition insecurity, limited nutrition knowledge, but all that I call them the drivers of malnutrition, not the primary cause, which is about nutrient intakes. The degenerative health, I've talked about it, the failing body organs due to different factors. And what I wanted us to note is that, unlike in the past, the degenerative health conditions like the diabetes, hypertension, and so forth, they used to be called the health conditions or diseases of the affluent, the rich, and so forth. Now things have really changed in that it's now really the trends are that these health conditions are becoming more and more prevalent on the African and East Mediterranean regions. And therefore, we are not at all off the hook. Instead, we have been hooked in these degenerative health conditions. And then now what inspires me to propose plans, and in this case, the traditional indigenous plans, food plans of Sub-Saharan Africa or of the African continent, is that there has been always a link or association, strong links and associations between diet and health, and even the health vitality, which is being able to live with a better well-being, not vulnerable to disease and so forth, otherwise at lower risk of degenerative health conditions. And then now for some decades now, there's a trend of shifting to plant protein sources or plant-based diets. One of the reasons for that, argued for that, is that plant foods or plant diets are viewed healthier than animal-based diets. And then there are other reasons, of course, that when you see it, that when we look at food plants, there are some advantages, especially from a socioeconomic issue and from environmental sustainability point of view. It's easier to grow plant with a lower carbon and water footprint than the animal products or animal food sources. And then, of course, affordability is generally plant foods are more affordable. And then there are other, of course, drivers that I'm also including on the slide there. And therefore, if the trends would be to shift to plant-based diets, then the African traditional indigenous food plants could actually play a key role there. Because in Africa, we have a huge diversity of food plants. They've been discovered probably by our ancestors a long time ago. They were wiser scientists or social sciences than we are, that we cannot argue really, because I have not in myself identified a food plant. I've always just got it traditional that it can be consumed as food. And then now, however, I think that the food plants of Africa have a huge potential to contribute actually to addressing malnutrition and degenerative health globally. And that if it were the case, really, it would be a great story for Africa, putting Africa positively on the global map, rather than Africa has always been on the global map usually for the wrong reasons, like wars, poverty, corruption, and so forth. If we could have a good story where Africa is able to feed itself very well from its plants and also feed the entire world, and thereby tackling the global nutrition crisis that I talked about. However, there are some challenges with that, putting it into actual practice or operation, that we are exploiting the traditional and indigenous food plants. And those challenges require research. And that has been the subject of my research and other colleagues in a virtual and sometimes institutional research program that we have between my colleagues at the Durban University of Technology, Professor Eric Mamoso, Dr. Nomsa Dlamini from the CSIR Pretoria, and Professor Unat Kolanis from the University of Zululand. We have been working together with this research focus, and I'm a co-leader of that. So I'm presenting what we've done so far in this research. And I would just want to put a disclaimer that as scientists and also academics, there's always been some philosophical differences in the way we interpret even research results. And therefore, where they disagree with me or they think I'm out of order in terms of my interpretation of the research findings, I take the responsibility, and this is a disclaimer, they are not responsible for it. Thank you for that, for noting that. And then the problem statement of our research program is given here. The African continent is well endowed with traditional indigenous food plants, and which could significantly contribute to the alleviation of malnutrition and degenerative health conditions that are particularly prevalent in developing regions, especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Unfortunately, most of these food plants are grossly underutilized, or the application as food sources is not really optimal. It appears that limited knowledge of the inherent properties of the food plants and the factors that affect their acceptance largely contributes to this underutilization. So it is, we think from the academic point of view, from a research point of view, that it is the limited knowledge of these plants in terms of their properties that could promote their utilization as food, and also limited knowledge on even socioeconomic factors, socio-psychological factors that could be affecting the acceptance for use. Why would our populations be rushing and switching over to maybe Western diets or diets from other regions, which they can hardly afford, and yet there's an abundance of these food plants on the continent, and not even capitalizing on them, that they could use them to feed themselves and then also make money, valorize them, add value to them, and generate wealth. I think for the scientists and other researchers, particularly academics, we have a role to play there in terms of unwinding these knowledge gaps that we think are limiting the utilization of these food plants. And therefore, the aim of the research program that I'm leading and from which I'm presenting this is that we think that consumer acceptance factors and the inherent properties of traditional and indigenous African plants may be manipulated or optimized to produce healthy and nutritional food products that are acceptable to consumers. If we knew very well the inherent properties and the factors that affect their acceptance, then we could promote, if that's well known, it can be manipulated for the better so that there's increased utilization of the food plants. Then therefore, the aim of the research program is to promote the utilization of traditional indigenous African food plants through generation of knowledge of consumer acceptance factors and inherent properties of these food plants. The outline of the research methodology, I'll just run through it very quickly to get to the actual selected studies. So I just want to put everybody on the same page in terms of what we call indigenous food plants, especially here of the African continent and what are traditional plants. From just a simpler definition would be if the plants are said to be indigenous in a region, let's say the African continent, there would be evidence, particularly scientific knowledge like botanical knowledge or historical knowledge that shows that they are native there. Their origins are in that place, in this case, the African continent. And then traditional food plants are very important as well, in the sense that they've adapted to that place, in this case, that region, in this case, the African continent, but not necessarily that they originated there. They are traditional because they've been consumed as food plants from generation to generation. Where I was talking about the indigenous knowledge of our ancestors, from which they traded with other cultures and adopted those food plants for cultivation or for use from the wild as food, but not necessarily that they originated on the African continent. In this research program that I'm talking about, I'm presenting my lecture on, we have studied some of the traditional and indigenous food plants, which I'm listing here just for you to have a picture of what I will try to cover. I cannot cover all in terms of what we found out or the research that we have done. I will just cover some. I will cover, for example, the Bambara groundnut, which is indigenous and traditional to the African continent. I will cover maize, in this case, in the form of biofortified maize, provitamin A biofortified maize, which is a traditional plant of Africa since the 16th century, about the 16th century. And then amaranthus species, some species of which are indigenous to Africa, but most of them not originated from North America. Then the other ones that we have covered, I've just given references of the work that we've done, some key publications that can be found to note what we found out about them or what we've done about them in terms of research. The research methodologies that were done is the traditional scientific method, since I'm from the science background, using the scientific method, cause and effects relationships under controlled conditions, where we try as much as possible to have a control or a reference to assess what we call a treatment or a sample in terms of what we are trying to observe. And then there's, of course, because my colleagues in the research program, particularly those from human and social sciences, they have warned me that you cannot solve socioeconomic problems, including nutritional problems, by just using your scientific method. You think if there's a problem of malnutrition, you run to the lab and start playing around with test tubes and solve it. you have to also have some other research paradigms like the interpretivist research paradigms that don't follow the scientific method. So we have included them in the research methodologies as appropriate. The research strategy for this research program has been that we think that the hypothesis can be tested or even operationalized if it comes out positive or acceptable through what we call a food-based nutrition intervention. And this food-based nutrition intervention especially focuses on food-to-food fortification. And the approach to the studies that we carried out, particularly because there's that fact about acceptance of the food, the acceptance factors that have to be investigated. So it has been participatory case studies where we have people from the selected communities, sample populations from the selected communities that represent or that are a represented case of vulnerability to malnutrition, and then we've included them in the studies to collect data, particularly on what factors are limiting the utilization of the food plants that are within their immediate environment. Then going to the research studies now that I'm reporting on for a systematic structure of how we've gone about it or how it's being reported. The aims are are interlinked or similar because it's an inherent study. But for just simplicity, it's simple of understanding or following how we've structured our research. I would say I'll report first on the studies in which we investigated the consumer acceptance of pro-VA maize foods and the retention of pro-vitamin A in the processed foods. And then after that, we then considered investigating the fortification of the pro-vitamin A biofortified maize and wheat in few studies that I'll report on with other African traditional and indigenous food plants. I will say it right away that when I talk about food, then I talked about maize, I talked about traditional, I talked about indigenous. Some people would think that where does maize fit in? And now that pro-vitamin A biofortified maize is also kicking in. Maize is arguably the leading traditional food plants on the African continent, particularly Africa south of the Sahara, the sub-Saharan region. So the keyword traditional food applies very well or 100% on maize, to maize, sorry. Right, so then I will start now reporting on the first part or the first group of studies that we conducted on consumer acceptance of pro-vitamin A biofortified maize foods and the retention of pro-vitamin A in the foods processed. So the introduction and the problem statement for this area of research or this research focus is that whilst we all know maize is a leading staple and a traditional staple globally, and arguably the topmost leader as a staple in the sub-Saharan region. And this maize is in the form of the white maize grain. Unfortunately, like other cereal grains, white maize grain is limited and in some cases devoid of essential nutrients. And then our over-reliance on white maize grain as a staple obviously makes us vulnerable to malnutrition, makes the population groups, particularly the rural-based communities or economically based population groups who cannot afford diverse diets, it makes them very vulnerable to malnutrition. And therefore, there is a need to try to work on the white maize grain in one phase or another, or fortify through perhaps fortification. That's what has been tried, to fortify the white maize products so that they then can have optimal nutritional composition. So, however, though that fortification strategy or overall fortification of foods, like commercial fortification, where nutrients are added in commercial foods, there's its own disadvantages, and those strategies are normally not affordable because given that I said the most vulnerable communities are found in the rural, some produce their own food, they process their own food, they are not going to buy fortified maize, commercial fortified maize and other food products. And therefore, other fortification strategies have been tried, one that I'll discuss in terms of what we have investigated in, but still, even the one that I'll discuss now about biofortification of maize, it has encountered problems which we have tried to address through research. So this is the pro-vitamin A biofortified maize, sometimes just in short called yellow maize or yellow-orange maize. It is a yellow to orange color, which is due to pro-vitamin A, carotenoid pigments, and other carotenoid pigments that are there. I would want us to be noted that apart from this biofortification that has occurred now as a strategy to address vitamin A deficiency, there's always been some variety, some yellow maize varieties that have been that have naturally been there. Some could be having some vitamin A content or pro-vitamin A content, but normally at low concentrations, or some, the yellow color does not follow, yellow-orange color, it doesn't follow that it has significant concentrations of vitamin A, or they may not even be present because the yellow color is due to a combination of carotenoid pigments, some which have vitamin A activity, some they don't. So biofortification then is a more high-tech approach to it, to make sure that it's not only just that it's by hit and miss that is yellow, and therefore maybe there's pro-vitamin A or vitamin A there. It is specifically engineered or designed that it has desirable levels of vitamin A or pro-vitamin A, which is a precursor of the vitamin A. And then that's the white maize grain that most of us, almost everybody knows about, which I said it is its nutritional deficiencies. Then now, the problem statement associated with pro-vitamin A biofortified maize is that it will start like the Harvest Plus Global Challenge Program started close around the late 2010 or earlier. It was a global challenge program to address malnutrition, particularly micronutrient deficiencies amongst communities of developing regions. So in the sub-Saharan Africa, particularly Southern Africa, the main leading micronutrient deficiency is vitamin A deficiency. And therefore, it was proposed by the Harvest Plus Challenge Program to biofortify or to work on the white maize grain, design a varieties of white maize that have desirable concentrations of pro-vitamin A carotenoids. And this was done mainly through conventional plant breeding to circumvent the problem of that. If it was said that it was GMO maize, then it may be rejected by the consumers. However, that biofortification of the maize to produce the yellow-orange maize, these challenges, has been found to have challenges of consumer acceptability. Previously, the yellow maize, whether biofortified or not, there were reports of challenges of consumer acceptability because of the unusual yellow color or unfamiliar yellow color, these sensory properties, the yellow color, the strong aroma or flavor, which consumers don't actually associate with maize, because the traditional maize or the default maize, the white maize grain. And therefore, when the breeders had done their work of producing the biofortified maize, people were not sure whether there would be problems encountered in terms of its adoption because of consumer acceptance issues. And therefore it was necessary then to investigate that would the current consumers who are targeted for this nutritional intervention using the Pro-VA maize, would they accept the product, the new product, the new biofortified maize, or there will be factors, maybe there will be factors that would affect the acceptance of the product, and then what are those factors and how they could be addressed. So it was subject to research, which we had to take on, and I had to take leadership when the Harvest Plus Challenge program asked me to take some leadership on that with other colleagues. In addition to the suspected consumer or low consumer acceptance of the Pro-VA maize, which was not known, there was also that part that it is known fundamentally that pro-vitamin A carotenoids, which are precursors of vitamin A, which is required by the human body, are sensitive to different conditions of food processing. But food processing methods are different. Generally, they are stable to some high temperatures, but under certain conditions of processing, usually food processing will involve cooking, otherwise conventional cooking. They are known fundamentally that they could be retained, otherwise there will be less destruction of them. However, this is dependent on various processing conditions, including the formulation of the maize as an ingredient with other, and also the cooking parameters. And therefore, it was necessary that then it should be investigated that if this maize were to be rolled out, which food types would optimally retain the provitamin A during processing. And if not, there would be some that are not retaining it. What could be done to improve the retention of provitamin A? And therefore, that the area of retention of provitamin A in the processed biofortified maize products became an item as part of our research brief that we had to tackle. Right. So what did we do about, how did we go about investigating consumer acceptance of yellow or Pro-VA, of Pro-VA maize in maize? So we could not, because it was targeted for the sub-Saharan African region in particular, this maize, as I said, and it is well known also that maize, white maize, is predominantly consumed amongst the other sub-regions, Southern Africa. And Zambia was chosen as an epicenter for trying to, one, develop the products and also to disseminate the information for adoption, otherwise to try to bring about adoption. But we know the cultures of sub-Saharan Africa, especially within the sub-regions like Southern Africa, including Zambia, that they are the same in terms of consumer, the food culture, what we consume and what type of foods. For example, within the food products that we consume, steamed porridges, thin porridges, the gruel, the beverages and so forth are similar across the region. And therefore we found it that we did not necessarily need to go to Zambia and to do the consumer acceptance studies. We could do it in South Africa if we carefully selected some population groups or communities that would be a case representing the rest of the consumers in the sub-Saharan African countries. So one study that I'm reporting, the first study we conducted was, the aim of the study was to determine the consumer acceptance of yellow of the Pro-VA maize in KwaZulu-Natal. KwaZulu-Natal is a province within the 9 South African regions, and it is characterized by communities that are very typical of sub-Saharan African communities, where the majority are based in the rural. Their staples is mainly maize, white maize, and they produce their own white maize, and they make these similar food products that I described. And therefore, we thought we could use it as a special case to investigate the consumer acceptance of the yellow maize and the factors that would affect its acceptance. So we conducted this, as I said, as a participatory case study in which we went around the peri-urban communities, actual rural communities in the province, and conducting focus group discussions to ask them what would be their perceptions of of consuming this maize if they knew it, and if they had been told about it as a vehicle for vitamin A, to deliver vitamin A to address the deficiencies and so forth. And then after those focus group discussions that I'm just I'm showing the verbatim here. In short, we found that the adults, otherwise the older consumers, had negative perceptions about the yellow maize, but they were willing to consume the yellow maize if it was cheaper than the white maize and was readily available in the local grocery shops or the local market. Of course, that about it being cheaper is a catch, because it's like being held hostage by the consumers. But the fact that they were saying they could consume it, they were willing to try it, it was something encouraging. But that was from that part of the start, which was the focus group discussions. Then we conducted also sensory evaluation, where we carried out consumers sensory evaluation panels. So we had samples of the Pro-VA maize that included the typical maize food products processed in KwaZulu-Natal, in the rural communities, and actually in the country, where we had sample with controls, of course, appropriate controls, which would be the white maize grain sample, and then the Pro-VA maize sample, and similarly thin porridges that are normally fed children, and then we had the stiff porridges that are known across the sub-Saharan African region with different names, like pap in South Africa, shima in Zambia, and so forth. So we included consumers of different demographic groups: primary school children, preschool children, secondary school children, and adults who were of non-school going age. So we included them in these consumer service studies. As you can see, they are evaluating the samples of the different food products that I mentioned there, and then they would be scoring them in terms of acceptability of the different characteristics, sensory attributes, the taste acceptability, color acceptability, aroma acceptability, and then overall acceptability. From that, then we can, from the sample, maybe it's a sample of, it would be a sample of more than 50 consumers forming the consumer panel of these different age groups. And then we would now calculate the population means in terms of the acceptability, in terms of the different attributes that we assessed. So some of our key findings from this study, we found that this preschool children preschool children preferred yellow maize food products more than the white food products, actually, which was quite surprising to find that, but we had an interpretation for it. We had to think about it, why. While this primary school, the primary school group preferred the white maize thin porridges. The thin porridges compared between the preschool children and the primary school children in terms of preference, pet preference test, and so forth. We found that the older children, who were the primary school children, had a preference for the white maize, which was according to the hypothesis anyway, but surprisingly, the preschool children did not, preferred the yellow maize. And then our interpretation of that was that perhaps, and then maybe include other adults as well, among the older consumers, we found that the acceptability of the Pro-VA maize food products was generally lower than that of white maize. But one other important finding was that although lower than white maize, there were variations in consumer acceptability with the food type. That variation it led us to think that, okay, if there can be variation between acceptability of thin porridge, stiff porridge, samp, and so forth, that then it opens an idea of that we could optimize the food formulations and move towards a more acceptable product using the Pro-VA maize. The fact that within those types, some that are more acceptable than the other, although lower than white maize, one could try to engineer or redesign the food products, maybe using other food ingredients to to improve the consumer acceptability of the Pro-VA maize, especially among the adult consumers. And then, moreover, from the focus group discussion, we had noted that these consumers, particularly the adult consumers, they had also, it was not only the sensory properties of the maize that probably led to them not it being unacceptable to them. They also had their socio-psychological factors that affected the acceptability of the maize, because they indicated that the maize was usually used. They know from the past that it was being used for food aid for the poor people. And, you know, it's also used as livestock feed and all that. So those perceptions, those negative perceptions also were contributing to that lower acceptability. And then we thought that that could be addressed maybe through nutrition education, as I'll discuss later, how we try to develop a nutrition education program to try to improve, to change the negative perceptions. Then in another study, we also bounced onto, okay, maybe before that, in terms of the preschool children and these younger children, we thought that their high acceptance or preference of the Pro-V maize compared to the white maize. It meant that from a sense point of view, when they were encountered with the white maize porridge and the yellow maize porridge, the aroma, the taste, or the flavor was actually more attractive to them, according to their sensory perceptions. And moreover, we thought that from a socio-psychological point of view, because from education I read that there's what is called social constructivism, where people's mindsets are developed as they grow. So these ones, their social construction was still at an infant stage, whereby they did not get to have this mindset, negative perceptions about the yellow maize. So their perception and acceptance or preference of the yellow maize may be based on that. They were more objective about it. They did not have any knowledge that would conflict what they perceived and so forth. So that, with those findings, we thought that straight away we could report that to the Harvest Plus Challenge Program leaders, that we have a good finding there. You could roll out, if we could work with caregivers, healthcare workers, they could actually target children and address vitamin A deficiency without really reformulating the same food products that they are feeding their children, but are not really optimal in terms of vitamin A content, like the white maize porridges and so forth. They could actually replace them with Pro-VA maize without any problems, because the consumers, the children will accept that. So that was quite a contribution in terms of what we thought could be contributed to dissemination. And then that was complemented by this study where we investigated the acceptance of complementary food prepared with the Pro-VA maize by Black caregivers in rural KwaZulu-Natal. These are our child caregivers. So we investigated how, because they are the custodians of, they usually decide what the children will be fed and so forth. So we thought that also it may not be necessary that the children, yes, they are willing to eat, but it will also depend on the caregivers if they are willing to feed the children this type of maize, the biofortified maize. And then we investigated that, and we found that from these results here, Pro-VA complementary porridge is complementary, means the foods that are fed children after they've been weaned, mainly. So we found that actually, if you see these results here, this is the overall acceptability of the products here. This is a variety or hybrid of Pro-VA maize and that one, and the reference one is the white maize grain or the control here. So here means overall acceptability of the product. So we found here, even when we carried out significant testing of these means, these are means of scores or rating of the different sensory attributes, and then there's overall acceptability. We found that there was no significant difference in the acceptance of the Pro-VA complementary food by the caregivers. And that finding was significant, as I indicated. It means then they would be willing to feed the children with the Pro-VA maize. And then we We also conducted further studies with the stiff porridges, the maize porridges. In these studies that we later conducted was to try now to further analyze, use the human subjects, trained human subjects, to actually analyze some sensory properties of the stiff maize porridges in terms of trying to find out what exactly is there. Is it only the yellow color or the aroma that is making it less acceptable to those adult consumers, not the caregivers, but the rest of them that I reported on earlier. So we carried out what is called descriptive sensory evaluation studies, where we use trained human subjects who are not necessarily the target consumers of that product, but they can be trained to use their senses to analyze the sensory properties of a food product and come up with what we call a sensory profile of the product. So we developed a protocol for that analysis. We trained them, we worked with them together, and they were able to rate then the porridges in terms of the key sensory attributes of that, to analyze it in terms of appearance, the aroma, texture, flavor, aftertaste, and all that. And then what came out of that was a sensory profile of the Pro-VA maize stiff porridge. So they described the Pro-VA maize porridge as one that was sticky, it was fine, it was with fine grease, with a high intensity or some residual grain in it, and having a slightly bitter aftertaste and having a cooked flavor and aroma. Whereas the intensities of these, particularly the slightly bitter aftertaste, was not even picked at all in the white maize, the control. And the intensities of all these other, like stickiness and so forth, they were not picked up in the white maize porridge, the control. And therefore, this gave us some more information, more inroads of saying now in further food formulations that would be aiming to improve the consumer acceptability of the Pro-VA maize, we would have to work on improving improving the formulations. And therefore, we went on now to then we also developed a study scale or a tool to improve consumer acceptability through education, consumer education, to change the scale, the consumer mindset, particularly the adult on that I'm leaving out without giving details. And also other studies that we did, as I said, was to try to investigate the retention of Pro-VA maize, Pro-vitamin A in the processed food products. And we found in most of the studies that generally there was a high retention of the Pro-VA. There was a high retention of the Pro-vitamin A carotenoids during cooking and so forth. And that was encouraging because it meant that if retention was all above 90%, there would be, then Pro-VA maize foods would be a good carrier to deliver the food products to the vitamin A or Pro-vitamin A to the target consumers. And then other studies that followed then were more on, we carried out more studies. For example, we also looked at the beverage. Amahewu is a very common maize beverage, but as I indicated, is made with white maize. It is fermented, it is sour. We checked its consumer acceptability again. It shows that we found that actually this one was generally acceptable, and also the retention of the Pro-VA maize was high. So that was the consumer acceptance. There were no differences between the white maize and the Pro-vitamin A maize in terms of acceptability general here. And therefore, in fact, the Pro-VA maize Amahewu was significantly higher, if you can see the means of overall acceptability, compared with the white maize Amahewu. So the fermentation process probably produced strong aromas, strong flavors that were attractive, and they were actually masking or attenuating or moderating the strong aroma, yellow color, or flavor of the Pro-VA maize. So fermented maize products would be a good selection of products to try to to deliver the Pro-VA maize to the target consumers. And then the next set of studies, I will just run through them quickly because of the time, but I wanted to mention that we started now working on formulating the Pro-VA maize, including it with other ingredients, in this case, the other traditional and indigenous food plants, with the aim of one, fortifying the maize, the Pro-VA, although the Pro-VA maize is fortified with provitamin A, it is still deficient in protein in terms of protein content and protein quality. There are some essential amino acids, lysine and tryptophan, are limiting in maize. And even when we investigated the Pro-VA maize, we found that it was as limiting as the white maize in these essential amino acids. And moreover, other nutrients, even the minerals, they are not at optimum concentrations in the white maize and also the Pro-VA maize. So the studies that followed here that I'm just summarizing were aimed at increasing the consumer acceptability, particularly to the adults in this case, of Pro-VA maize through formulation with other food products that would attenuate its undesirable sensory properties, as was indicated with amageu, and then also try to further fortify the Pro-VA maize in terms of when it's delivered, then we fortify it through food-to-food formulation so that the Pro-VA maize will be delivered as a composite with other food plants as ingredients to improve its nutritional value. So we carried out studies where we added amaranth. It's not moving. We used amaranth. Amaranthus is a herb. Amaranthus is a vegetable herb, a vegetable that is dominant in the African continent, although its origins could be South America, but there are some species that are found that are said to be indigenous within Africa. This amaranthus, in the form of leaves in particular, is consumed at a household traditional level. There are limited or no commercial products or where amaranthus leaves are used as an ingredient in commercial food processing. So we thought this was an opportunity to try to introduce it as an ingredient in the maize food products and even the commercial products. And so our first study, this is the amaranthus with this leafy, that's some species that I'm showing there. Our first study, we attempted to incorporate amaranthus leaves in maize snacks, which are popular food products for the children and other. And in this case, the maize snacks were made with Pro-VA maize, but then supplemented with amaranthus. Improvement, obviously, amaranthus is higher in Pro-VA than the amaranthus also contains Pro-VA in it. And then we process the snacks and assess the retention of Pro-VA. And we found that actually when we increased the concentration of amaranthus leaves in the snacks, there was a corresponding increase in the concentration of the Pro-VA. And at the same time, even the increase, there was also an increase in the retention of the Pro-VA in the amaranthus Pro-VA maize amaranthus leaf supplemented snacks. So those the results indicated that there was a potential that the food industry could use amaranthus leaves as an ingredient and together with the Pro-VA maize to make healthier and nutritious maize snacks, replacing the white maize snacks. Then we also did investigate supplementing wheat products, the nucleus in this case with amaranthus leaves, just using the same idea, the same concept that we did with the snacks, and we found again an improvement in the nutritional composition as expected because of the higher nutritional value of the amaranthus leaf. And also there were no problems with the consumer acceptability of these products. You can see here, this is the control Inaugrals. Inaugrals are made with wheat, but now we're increasing the concentrations of amaranthus leaves from 0% in the control to 3%. The product was becoming darker, and we thought it would result in lower consumer acceptability. But to our surprise, the consumer acceptability was not a problem. But then there were gains in the nutritional value in terms of mineral content, protein content, and so. And then also there was a gain in the antioxidant activity of the Inaugrals. Antioxidants that are bioactive substances that were found in amaranthus would be responsible for an increase in the antioxidant activity of the Inaugrals, which would be potential of health benefit because the degenerative health conditions are linked to lower antioxidant content in the blood, but they are linked to, in terms of, there's a negative relationship between developing degenerative health conditions, like even some types of cancer, with intake of foods that are high in antioxidant. And therefore, we consider then foods that contain higher antioxidant as healthy from the fact that they mitigate against they mitigate the risk of development of degenerative health conditions. And this was shown here, like when we had these results. And there was no negative effect on consumer acceptability. Adding amaranthus up to 3%, there was no negative effect on consumer acceptability of the Inaugrals. We also, the last is the Bambara. We also carried out studies where we proposed the use of Bambara groundnut in fortifying Pro-VA maize and also making other food products like purees and so forth, because the Bambara groundnut is nutrient-rich, particularly in protein, quite high. It's a nutrient-rich legume and it's indigenous traditionally in Southern Africa, but it is grossly underutilized as a food. There are limited commercial food products that use Bambara groundnut as an ingredient, and yet it is so well adapted, particularly to sub-Saharan Africa. If the ingredients it was used as an ingredient in commercial food processing, that would contribute to affordable protein-rich foods. And also the farmers, the traditional farmers, subsistence farmers who produce this, then they would have a market because there will be an uptake from the food processing industry of the Bambara groundnut. So that's the Bambara groundnut. In our Nguni languages, we call them Indluvu. So they are different, the varieties or cultivars of different colors. So what we found is that for most of the characteristics, when we compared it with the dry bean, including physical properties, nutritional properties, and the effect of processing on the nutritional value and other properties, including antioxidant, we found that the antioxidants, the nutrients, they were higher in Bambara compared to the dry bean, and also the retention levels were high when the Bambara groundnuts were being processed into different food products. And that result of those assessments, then also even the digestibility of the protein, we assessed it, we found that it was highly digestible, and yes, there will be some need to improve it compared to maybe soya bean protein and the reference proteins like fish or egg protein. However, it was of acceptable level of digestibility, and the amino acid profile of the Bambara groundnut was quite good. And then we carried out then some studies where we tried now incorporating it into some complementary foods. So we made a puree. We asked the communities, the target communities, if they knew Bambara, because we know that there's a low uptake of use of Bambara groundnut, particularly in South Africa and maybe other parts of Sub-Saharan Africa. And then we asked them why they would not be using it when it was so adapted and it was growing well and they could plant it. There were issues around perceptions that they thought it was not, they did not know it, for example, the knowledge, and also they had not heard anything positive about it, but they were willing to try it if they could purchased cheaper, like the Pro-VA maize. So with that, we tried to make some products, the puree, which could be used as a complementary food for the children. And we found improvement in the product. And then we checked also the sensory properties, whether the puree would be acceptable. And we found some good acceptability levels, which varied with varieties and so forth. And also we found that, again, here, if you look with age, hello, Chief? No, not yet. Sorry, I'm sorry about that. And then there were we tried then to combine the Bambara groundnut with Pro-VA biofortified amaheo, the one that I spoke about earlier. We fermented it without adding Bambara. Now we added Bambara as a fortificant in making amaheo. And again, our results showed improvements in nutritional composition as we expected. And most importantly, the consumer stability of the product was as good as the white maize products of amaheo, and also without Bambara added. In fact, in some of the sensory attributes here, we found that there was improvement in the acceptability of the product when we added Bambara, which means that the Pro-VA maize sensory properties like the yellow color, the strong aroma would be countered by the strong beany flavor, the brown color of the Bambara, and the two, when they're interacting, would, if they are carefully designed, actually, they would moderate each other to an extent that you can have a product formulated that is very well acceptable and of high nutritional value. So that was the suggestions from these indications. And then we had also, we tried to incorporate the Bambara groundnut in an instant maize flour made with Pro-VA maize. Again, we found improvements in nutritional composition. There were the physical properties of the flour were not that were quite acceptable compared to the control. Obviously, the nutritional composition improved, particularly because Bambara is high in fiber, it's high in protein. There would be improvement in the nutritional composition. And most importantly, the consumer acceptability was also acceptable, as shown here. We didn't have any problems of consumer acceptability when we added Bambara groundnut into Pro-VA maize flour. In fact, there was an improvement in the consumer acceptability. So these studies are just highlighting what we've done in trying to investigate how Pro-VA maize can be adopted for addressing vitamin A deficiency, and more so, how Pro-VA maize can be a vehicle on which we can ride on and add other traditional and indigenous African food plants to come up with foods that are nutrient rich and they have high antioxidant activity, and therefore they could contribute to addressing degenerative health conditions. So the next part is my conclusions to this. The conclusions from these studies that I presented is that we have found that, as we had thought, we have found that there are factors that actually affect or even limit the acceptance of traditional indigenous food plants. And however, the acceptance of these food plants, like in the case of the Pro-VA maize, which was newly introduced, the acceptance of these food plants would, when they are processed into foods, would vary with food type. And also the acceptance could vary with the demographic factors of the consumers, as was the case with preschool children preferring the Pro-VA maize. And therefore, that provides an opportunity to carefully design food products. One could go up targeting by population groups in some cases, which is easy. For example, in South Africa, we have a nutrition, we have a school feeding program. The food plants, including Pro-VA maize and the and these other food plants, we can make food formulations that can be then rolled out and be used to alleviate or to mitigate the risk of malnutrition among these population groups. Whereas at the higher tech level, like in commercial food processing, there are some methodologies that can be used to work on the design of the product in terms of formulation and processing conditions. Given the fact that we have said it varies with food type, it means one can really optimize and come up with food formulations that are more acceptable to the consumers. We found out that there is a good opportunity from these research findings. They suggest a good opportunity to improve the acceptability of the Pro-VA and also the other food plants, the traditional food plants, if they are processed into food products by actually combining them, blending them, and in the process, there's food-to-food fortification. Therefore, there's nutrient complementation, the proteins increasing from the legumes, and so forth, and the amaranthus. And then also, most of these food plants that are indicated, particularly the amaranthus in this case, and the bambara groundnut, they are high in phytochemicals, these chemical substances that have antioxidant activity, and therefore they can be used in that way. If we combine these formulations carefully, we can come up with food products. And more so, we can try to improve the acceptance of food products, particularly those for nutritional intervention, by designing good nutrition education programs, and as I demonstrated with that innovative food products. So our future perspective in the research is to try to investigate the use of proteins as proteins from indigenous and traditional food plants as ingredients in commercial food processing and food formulations. We've already done some work with some of these food plants, including the Trichia species and the Bohemia, which are very abundant in sub-Saharan Africa. And we also propose that since we demonstrate the concept of being able to produce some foods that are fortified, that include the food plants, the African food plants. However, we're still not done yet in terms of that. We're not really sure whether these nutrients are available accessible by the human tissues, because processing can cause reduction in the availability of the nutrients and so forth within the food matrix. Therefore, we propose carrying out studies in future on these foods that were proposed, these innovative food products in terms of nutrient availability. And we also propose working with in terms of rolling out adoption, to work with the health sector, nutrition sector groups to try to promote the use of African traditional indigenous food plants in addressing malnutrition. And then also try to bring on board the commercial food processing industry, if we demonstrate these findings to them, if they have the idea that if they can come on board in terms of using the ingredients of these food plants in commercial food processing. We are also proposing with the food-to-food fortification concept, we are also proposing to bring in other protein-rich foods that are abundant and their use would be sustainable from an environmental point of view. And they are in thing presently that are the insects. So we propose food formulations in future that will also include insects as ingredients. We have already done some preliminary work to look at the effect of processing on the nutritional content of these insects, and we found already there are indications of some food processing methods that can be used to retain the nutrients which can be delivered to the consumers and address malnutrition. So I thank you for attending to my lecture, and I have several acknowledgements, starting with the funders listed here. I also acknowledge the postgraduate students that have been with us together. They are the ones who have done the work actually. So many of them, most of them are doctors, some are professors, and I've listed most of them here. I'm thankful to them for being willing to work with us under my leadership and my colleagues. And I'm thankful to my immediate colleagues in the Department of Dietetics and Human Nutrition. They've been patient with me all the time when I have my ideas that sometimes look out of order in terms of trying to conduct research and trying maybe to bring them on board when they have their other interests and so forth. So I'm grateful to my colleagues for that, including my former head of department here, Professor Ellen Monda. And then we have colleagues, of course, in the school and college. They've been very supportive, including the college leadership. Some of them have left the university, but I have listed them here. I'm so grateful to my academic mentors. Professor John Taylor has been such a great inspirational mentor of the University of Pretoria. You actually stimulated me, or actually convinced me to join academia when I did a master's degree under his leadership. And he taught me very well about use of the scientific method that I was talking about. And together with his colleague, Professor JP Tutu was my actual main supervisor for my PhD. He has been very supportive and now a colleague. When I had a local mentor, Ignatius Salai, when I was doing my PhD and doing part-time, he was my local mentor here at UKZN, and I'm thankful to him. And I started liking research in the earlier years when I was doing undergraduate studies, and then later when I was working as a technician in a university. And the inspirational person to bring me into doing research was Professor Richard Okapoe. He's a retired professor. And then my research colleagues whom I mentioned here, of course, they've been friends, colleagues, and so forth. Professor Eric Amonso will always say, Baba, what are you up to? There's no science there. And let's try some science, please. And Professor Olat Kolaris will say, you will not solve the world's problems by going to a lab. And that has really enriched me and made me a rounded researcher. And then we have many collaborators. Professor John Derer actually was the one who actually introduced me or inducted me into the Pro-VA maize. This is a leading breeder in the world, actually. And I have had good support from, for example, Professor Tafadzwa, always being a research collaborator, very active, and Samson Tesfaye, and all these guys I have listed. There's Opiro, who has come of late in that research from University of Malanga. I have a colleague who is now at the University of Limpopo, was at the ARC. He has been very supportive in our research, including the research on Moringa, which I did not discuss here. We have international colleagues that have also been very supportive. Dr. Kevin Pearsley and Natalia, who are with the CIMIT in Mexico. And we have another research collaborator now who has just started, who was a former student called Samson Oyenyika. He's at the University of Lincoln. We will try to find us some pounds to continue our research from the UK. Special thanks to my friends who are not in academia, but we have always been supportive in different ways, who would say to me, oh, you look so bored, you look so tired. Please, let's go for coffee, or let's come for a beer. Stanley Mguchini, Jablan Tombeni, Raymond Mahachani Mlau, and Dr. Langeli Shesmela, and all these guys that I'm mentioning here, they've been so supportive of my work. And special thanks, of course, to my family, my mothers, Sevi, Pelile, Ellen, and my most inspirational and confidence-building dad, the late Mr. James Siwela. He was ever supportive. I wish you are still living to see what I'm up to in terms of academic work. I've got my siblings who are listed here. We have particularly Tembeli, Shebektemba, Nosizi. They've been so supportive, and my cousins, several cousins, but most so to mention, particularly when I was doing my PhD studies, I was well supported by my cousin called Dr. Jabulani Mangena. And in my earlier years of study, when I was at primary school, particularly, I got a lot of support from my uncle called Ronald Love, a brother to my mother, Sevi, and heaps of thanks to my closer family, the most special and dearest, the A-team, Mrs. Sanele Siwela, and my daughters, Precious, Noktaba, Nonhlanhla, and Nomagogo. But not least, all my other friends and colleagues whom I have not been able to mention by name. Thank you very much. Thus, I end there. Thank you, Professor Kubanali, the Dean, and my immediate boss, Dean, Professor Julius Biya, and most importantly, to the listeners of my talk.
Thank you, Professor Siwela. That was an excellent talk and a very inspiring talk as well. I'm glad that you are able to study the indigenous food plants that we have in South Africa. South Africa has a wealth of South African indigenous plants, and especially exploring the nutritional value of these plants. In a lot of cases, people think about food security as just something to eat and don't really worry about the nutritional value. So I'm very glad that your research also explores the nutritional value of the plants that we also eat. So very well done. I see you've done a very, very large body of work, a very good body of work, very fitting for a full professor. So you've actually earned your full professorship, and congratulations to you. It just remains for me to thank you for joining us this afternoon and giving your inaugural lecture and enlightening people on what your research is all about. So thank you for that, Professor Siwela. And to all our guests that have joined us, all our distinguished guests and guests in our university and the schools in our university, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon, but I think it was time well spent. So thank you, Prof. Siwela, again, and thank you, colleagues and guests for joining us, and I wish you a good Friday and a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.